This is not Richard, your neighbor, or Richard from, down the street. This is a well-respected Christian philosopher and theologian. Now, he says very clearly that there's basically three ways he thinks that someone could affirm the doctrine of the Trinity or be justified in their belief of the doctrine of the Trinity. Today's episode, guys, I have a very exciting episode for you in which I will be reviewing a short clip from very well-known Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne. Now, he's widely recognized as one of the greatest Christian philosophers and theologians of the 20th century, and really over the past 50 to 60 years. He's up in age now, but still, nevertheless, he is well respected in the Christian community as one of the greatest Christian philosophers and theologians, like I said, of the past 50 or so years. Now, it's very interesting. I came across a lecture that he did in which he very clearly expressed that he doesn't believe that the doctrine of the Trinity can be clearly extracted from the Gospels or the New Testament documents. Now, that's extremely important. He's not therefore saying, and I don't want people to be confused, as if the Gospel writers were somehow Orthodox Muslims or something of that. That's not what I'm arguing. However, in dialogues back and forth between Christians and Muslims, we argue much over Christological issues. Who was Jesus? Who was he sent for? Was he God in the flesh? Was he not? Did he teach the doctrine of the Trinity? Did the earliest followers of Jesus actually believe in the doctrine of the Trinity? What does the New Testament say? Did the New Testament authors believe that Jesus was God in the flesh? Did they teach and preach the doctrine of the Trinity to their followers and in their writings? All of these questions are typically debated between Christians and Muslims. And Richard Swinburne makes some very interesting comments in this video which are related to those debates. So I just want to share my screen here and play a small section of this lecture he did, and then give some comments and thoughts on it, inshallah.
It seems to me, although I shall not argue it here, that even if you regard the New Testament as an infallible source of doctrine, you could not derive from it a doctrine of the Trinity. Although there are many passages in the New Testament which speak of Christ as divine, and other passages which speak of the Spirit of God and the Spirit of Christ and of the Comforter, there are non-Trinitarian ways of interpreting the latter passages, which are just as plausible as interpreting them as expressing a doctrine of the Trinity. In other words, it seemed to me you can get two divine persons out of the text of the New Testament, but not three. But I'm not going to argue with that today, but I think quite a number of New Testament scholars would probably agree. So, unless Christians today recognize some good a priori argument for this doctrine, and that's going to be fairly few Christians today, I don't think anyone would be justified in believing it unless they believe that the very fact that the church had interpreted these passages in a Trinitarian way was strong reason for believing that doctrine. Those who do recognize the church's authority to teach normally recognize the Nicene Creed, promulgated by the First Council of Constantinople, as the first binding authoritative statement from which a doctrine of the Trinity can be derived. And indeed, that creed is the only authoritative binding statement on this matter, which is required alike by Catholics, Orthodox, Monophysites, Anglicans, and some Protestants.
Just wanted to share that clip there, but although it was short in terms of length, it was very insightful and very informative. So I just want to break this down. Now, Richard Swinburne, again, as I mentioned, this is not Richard, your neighbor, or Richard from, down the street. This is a well-respected Christian philosopher and theologian. Now, he says very clearly that there's basically three ways he thinks that someone could affirm the doctrine of the Trinity or be justified in their belief of the doctrine of the Trinity. The first is by demonstrating that the New Testament texts actually teach and clearly explicate the doctrine of the Trinity. He doesn't think that this is possible. He says that many New Testament scholars, he thinks, actually agree with him on this, that the doctrine of the Trinity is not clearly taught in the New Testament or the Gospels. And he also mentions that, well, at the very most, you could maybe get two divine persons, in which case you'd have Binitarianism, or the idea that there are two divine persons in God, rather than Trinitarianism. Now, I would reject that. I mean, it depends on what you actually mean by Binitarianism or two divine persons, because I think even in the highest Christology in the New Testament, you don't have it clearly taught that Jesus is co-equal, co-eternal to the Father, meaning a second divine person in terms of his divinity and status equal to the Father. Nevertheless, Richard Swinburne is saying that at most you could get is Binitarianism. Now, that's a really interesting admission from someone of his stature and status, given the fact, as I said, that this is a hotly debated issue between Muslims and Christians, and even Trinitarian Christians and Unitarian Christians. Then he goes from that and says, well, there is another way that you could possibly affirm that the doctrine of the Trinity is true. And this is one way that he tries to do it, which is by giving an a priori rational argument, which is to say, an argument that is based on reason and not necessarily based on the text of Scripture or tradition or so-called church authorities, but a rational argument for the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, he goes on in the rest of the lecture to attempt to do that, but he even admits, which is something very important to notice, that most Christians today would not believe in not only Richard Swinburne's attempt at a rational argument for the necessity of the doctrine of the Trinity, but really any a priori rational argument or philosophical argument for the necessity of the Trinity. He says that most Christians or most Trinitarians wouldn't actually agree with this, right? And he goes on to give this sort of argument for the Trinity from divine love, which many people would be familiar with, that the only way in which a God could be perfectly loving is if he existed in community of a trinity of persons from eternity. Now, I reject this argument. I've gone through it in detail and have given detailed objections and rebuttals in other videos that are available on my channel. So I'm not going to do that here. But I want people to note that even a proponent like Richard Swinburne of this argument recognizes that most Christian Trinitarians don't accept this type of argumentation or really any a priori rational arguments for the necessity of the Trinity. This doesn't only include lay Christians in the pews in churches on Sunday. It also includes academic, professional philosophers and theologians that are Trinitarians that don't accept this type of argumentation. Then he goes to a third possible way. So if you're not actually persuaded by the New Testament explicitly teaching the Trinity, which he doesn't think there are actually good arguments for that. He thinks that they can be read in other ways, whether it be through Arian perspective or, and I would argue even from a Unitarian perspective, biblical Unitarianism. He says, well, if you're not, you can't do that, and you're not really persuaded by a priori rational arguments, and similar to the ones that he's going to go on to give in the presentation, then the only third possible way of doing it is by considering ecumenical councils like the Council of Constantinople in 381 or the Nicene Creed, which does seem to assert the doctrine of the Trinity is true, unless you believe that those authorities or those councils are actually genuine and that we do have to submit to them, then you wouldn't have any option to really believe that the Trinity is true. So he says there are three options: either through Scripture, which he doesn't think can be done, through a priori arguments, which he does think can be done, and he goes on to attempt to do that, but I don't think that's really justified. And he even admits that many Christian Trinitarians would not agree with him about that second option of rational argumentation for the existence of the Trinity. Or the third is to take it based on the authority of the church's teaching. I have questioned this, and what I would argue is that maybe somebody could accept that third position. However, in a recent video presentation that I've given on Blogging Theology, Brother Paul's channel, with the help of Brother Bassam, who was interviewing me, we went through basically the first 300 years of the Christian tradition, and we surveyed 6 very well-known and influential church fathers or church writers of those first 300 years. And I think that I demonstrated quite clearly that none of them actually taught the doctrine of the Trinity or believed in the doctrine of the Trinity. Now, why is that so important? Well, if that's true, and I recommend that people go check out that very long marathon 7-hour video in which the PowerPoint to the presentation that I gave on Paul's channel is in the description of his video, and I'll also place it in the description of this video as well. It's available for free download. I recommend that people double check my sources and see whether or not they actually agree with the claims and the investigation that I went through in that video. Nevertheless, I argue that in the first 300 years, the doctrine of the Trinity was not actually clearly taught by the early church fathers or the early scholars or ulama of the Christian tradition. Now, if that's true, then that casts some doubt on whether or not the New Testament text actually clearly teaches the doctrine of the Trinity. Because if it does, and if the early church fathers are aware of the New Testament text and had access to the New Testament, as many of them did, at least in part or majority, then we would expect them, if it's clearly taught there, for them to affirm it and for them to teach it in their writings. But because we don't see that, then that gives us good reason to doubt that the New Testament actually teaches the doctrine of the Trinity. Also, if the early church fathers and the New Testament don't actually teach the doctrine of the Trinity, then that casts doubt on whether Jesus himself actually taught the doctrine of the Trinity. Because if Jesus himself actually clearly, explicitly taught the doctrine of the Trinity to his early apostles and followers, then we would expect them to preach it to their students, and we would expect that theology to wind up in the New Testament. And if it's in the New Testament, then we would expect the early scholars of the Christian tradition who are responsible for exegeting or giving tafsir of the New Testament to come to that same conclusion. However, because we don't find that, that winds up in a domino effect of it not being clearly taught by the early church fathers to probably not being taught in the New Testament, and therefore most likely probably not taught by Jesus and his early followers. So that's the argument that I make in that video. I just wanted to relate my presentation to my presentation on this topic on blogging theology to what Richard Swinburne has to say. And just to summarize again, he said there's basically 3 ways that a Trinitarian could affirm or justify their position, which is either through scripture, which he doesn't think can be done, through rational a priori argumentation, which he does think that can be done. I've given reasons to reject this in other videos, but he even admits that most Trinitarians are not persuaded by rational arguments for the necessity of the Trinity, or third, by church authority or church tradition. And as I said, I've given arguments against that, specifically in detailed form on my recent video on blogging theology. With that being said, guys, I recommend that you go and check out that presentation that I gave, and free download to that presentation will be available in the description of this video. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video and you enjoy my channel in general, please consider subscribing to the channel and putting the notification bell on so that you get notified for future videos. Also, consider liking this video as well as the other videos that you enjoy on my channel. It really does help with the algorithm, as well as commenting on these videos and sharing these videos. Share this video with your Christian friends or maybe even family members or neighbors. Share this on your social media platforms, no matter how big or how small they are. It really does help, guys. Trust me. And if you want to go above and beyond and support my channel, then the best way to do so is at the GoFundMe link, which is pinned at the top of the description of this video, as well as my other videos. Now, I do need your guys' support because I am doing this full time. I am doing Dawah full time. So any support that you can give at that GoFundMe link would be much appreciated. With that being said, guys, I want to thank you all for your continued support and your patience. But until next time, guys, inshallah, I'll see you all again then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.